Chapter 5. First Encounters. Chris, James and Rachel arose early at around 0400. It was still dark outside, so they made their way carefully down to the quayside below Ince Castle. It wasn't a castle in the conventional sense of the word, but a manor house with 4 towers, built in 1642 by Henry Killigrew. Supposedly, according to local folklore, he kept 4 wives, one in each tower, each unbeknown to the others. The house had had some pretty notable owners over the centuries that followed, including Mr. H.R. Somerset, whose yacht had won the Fastnet race. The current owners of the manor were first Viscount Boyd of Merton and his wife. They had kindly agreed for the Rib to be left at anchor below the castle a few days before. James and Chris prepared the boat for the trip up to Martinstow. Chris showed James the surprises that Ollie and Gaz had made just in case they needed them to dissuade anybody from following them. 10 clusters of 3 grenades, each attached to a small buoy, which would result in the grenades being suspended just below the water's surface. Perfect for taking out any vessel that tried to follow. We'll have to be careful with these, considering we're right next door to a naval base. There won't be a lot of time once the first one goes off. I can guarantee all hell's going to break loose ashore if we do end up using these. I don't really fancy the challenge of evading the might of the Royal Navy. It was hard enough the last time, Chris stated as he packed them away into the side locker of the Rib's centre console, referring to the last mock war games they'd both been involved with, where they narrowly scraped past a frigate with a 2-man mini-sub. These should be easily accessible if the need arises to use them. Right, I think that's everything. Stand by to cast off. Turning the key in the ignition, the 2 twin 300 horsepower Mercury engines roared into life. Easing their way out of the harbour into the main flow of the Tamar estuary, they made their way upstream towards the tributary that would take them to their final destination. All seemed relatively quiet, meandering their way along the Tamar. The water was very calm, with no wind to speak of. Silent running was crucial at this stage, which made for a rather slow journey. The horsepower was always there if required. James was excited, but he had one of his nagging feelings, so was apprehensively looking around from the bows of the boat. The long black boat cut quite a menacing picture as it cruised through the river estuary. It was apparent from the expression on Chris's face that he was hoping to receive a little unwanted attention. Secretly, he was itching to try out those cluster buoys, just to see exactly what the mixologists had created this time. Unknown to him at this time, he would soon get his wish a little further upstream. 2 men sent by Mr. Leach sat huddled in the cockpit of their Antares 780, lying just off the China Fleet golf course. Having noticed Flack organising his Rib below Ince Castle, they had decided to intercept him and his co-conspirators upriver, away from Devonport Naval Yard. On the deck sat an open crate containing 2 M16 machine guns, and adjacent to this lay a tactical rocket launcher to finish the job. James spotted the Antares 780 as they passed under the Tamar Bridge. The boat had grabbed James's attention because it was the only boat on the water to have all the cabin lights on at that time, when most other people would be fast asleep. It was possible that the occupants were rising early to catch a favourable tide, or needed to set out early in order to make a port by a certain time. He decided to keep one eye on the vessel to see what would happen as they passed it. She certainly was no longer at anchor, but just on tick-over, holding position, which again was odd. One would expect a vessel to be making way once the anchor was aboard, and there was no evidence of any fishing rods over the sides. Chris elected to give the vessel a wider berth than usual, just in case. Sure enough, as the gap between the two vessels increased to around 20 cable lengths, the Antares moved off from where it had been holding station, taking up the exact course of their boat. So his lordship has decided to engage us after all, it seems, Chris thought to himself, a large smile spreading across his face. James could see the sheer delight on Chris's face, a mischievous look, one he'd seen all too often in the past, a telling look that Chris was about to wreak absolute havoc. "Let's see how they cope with the mixologist's concoction, shall we?" Chris declared. Chris slowed the boat right down in order to draw their pursuers in. James opened the locker and took out two of the cluster boys. "How long's the fuse on these things?" "Not exactly sure, to be honest. I think they said 5 seconds, but you never quite can tell with those two. Just hold off for a bit. This may just turn out to be some innocent mariners, and I don't want to blow up the wrong people. We'll have to let them make the first move. It's likely to get a little hot under the collar if they are Norwood's men." The vessel behind closed to within 20 metres. A man appeared at the bow holding a machine gun and proceeded to open fire. Rachel took cover, crouching behind the engines mounted on the transom. Projectiles from the blazing muzzle whizzed past the inflatable tubes of the craft. One grazed James's ear. "Son of a bitch! That's going to leave a scar. I've had enough of this. Have some of that," he exclaimed as he pulled the pin out from one of the clusters and tossed it over the transom of the rib. A little over 5 seconds later, the water around the buoy erupted skywards, sending spray and shards of metal in all directions. Unfortunately, it didn't have the desired effect of taking the pursuing boat out, as it had exploded a few seconds after the boat had passed the homemade mine. "More speed! We need to increase the gap!" James shouted to Chris at the wheel. "Hold on!" Chris replied as he opened up the throttle. He made a series of tight turns to both port and starboard, zigzagging to avoid the incoming shots. As the gap increased between the two vessels, James chucked more of the clusters over the side in quick succession. Both caused the vessel following to take avoiding action, and a second detonation must have damaged one of her twin screws. She started to slow. "They appear to be breaking off. I think she's damaged." "Shall we finish them off?" James shouted to Chris. "No time. Those explosions have awoken Devonport. I think it's time to make a hasty exit." Sure enough, as soon as the first of the blasts had erupted, all hell broke loose at the Royal Navy docks. Sirens could be heard blaring out across the water. Lights were flashing all across the quaysides. Spotlights from the nearest frigates were starting to scan the water. Men were visibly scrabbling up ladders, ducking through hatchways, and scurrying up gangways to mount their gunnery positions. This much action had not been seen on any British ship since that fateful day when HMS Hood, accompanied by HMS Prince of Wales, had engaged the Bismarck and Prince Eugen at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. The Antares had dropped off completely now. Obviously their pursuers did not have the stomach or the skill to face the Royal Navy, and had slipped away into the night, which was exactly what Chris and James decided to do as well, before the rigid raiders in the process of being launched were dispatched from Devonport. Chris slammed the throttle right down. The Mercury engines, which up until that point had just been purring, let out a mighty roar. The bite of the twin turbines was so deep that the rib lurched forwards, the bows rearing out of the water like a motorbike pulling a wheelie, before gradually flattening off as the boat reached the plain. "Make for that large fog bank over there," James shouted, pointing to the large misty formation just off the coast. "It'll cause havoc with the Navy's radar. Will give us a chance to disappear." The rib hurtled across the water in excess of 55 knots towards the massive bank of fog, and was soon consumed by it. It's a good thing the GPS still works, otherwise I wouldn't know where the hell I'm going. Keep a lookout for any anchored boats, you two. How's the ear? Mate, at this speed and with this visibility, you won't have any time to avoid anything. Stay mid-channel, or slow the fuck down. And it's a lot better than the shoulder, James replied, as he took his hand away from his left shoulder to reveal a large bloody area on his jacket. Shit, Rachel, see if you can treat that. There's a first aid kit in the port side hatch of the console. It's a lot worse than it looks. The bullet just nicked the top of my shoulder. Only a flesh wound. Just get me a packet of that quick clot field dressing. Should do the trick for now. They remained inside the thick fog, hugging the coastline, as they navigated the last mile up the Tavy tributary that would carry them the rest of the way to Martinstow. The dawn was beginning to break as the craft slowly glided up towards the boathouse at Martinstow. The early morning mist rising up from the grass floated just above the meadows in front of the great house. Chris skillfully manoeuvred the rib into the boathouse, closing the doors behind. Nobody would see the vessel from the water now. Stepping off the boat onto the jetty, the dissipating fog swirled around their ankles, creating strange, ghostly atmosphere as they walked up to the empty house. The only sound was that of the gravel path, lightly crunching underfoot. Rachel shuddered slightly and moved closer to James as they approached the great Palladian house. With all this mist, this place gives me the creeps. It seems to have somehow taken on a dark persona, she whispered to James. That's not surprising. It gives most people the creeps now that it's deserted. It's had a pretty murky past. Many curious things have happened here over the years, and not all of them were that nice, James mysteriously replied, causing Chris to burst out into laughter. Don't pay any attention to him. He's just trying to wind you up. Middleton, leave the poor girl alone. She's had quite enough excitement for one day. We wouldn't want her fainting into your arms now, would we? Actually, don't answer that question. I know what you're like, he said with a wry smile. I can't blame a chap for trying now, can you? James retorted, winking at Rachel. She blushed a deep shade of red. Exactly what kind of girl do you think I am, Middleton? I'm still trying to work that one out, James replied with a cheeky grin. Oh, please. We're not on the latest dating show. There's no time for these shenanigans. We've got work to do. It will only end badly for both of you, especially you, young lady. Don't let him lead you astray. I know what he's like. Middleton, focus. Which door do we need? Oh yes, the one on the left down there. It's the old servants' entrance. It'll be the easiest way to access the library. I just hope that we don't have to knock down too many walls to find the secret vaults. Not necessary anymore. Having spoken at length to your uncle last night, according to him, when the decision was taken to restore the library, it was felt that it would spoil the property if it were remodelled. So they only replaced what was damaged. No walls to knock down, I'm afraid. Probably a good thing considering the state of your shoulder. It's not that bad. Shame. I was looking forward to the exercise. Oh well. I suppose we are on the rather tight schedule. It's still going to take a bit of time to actually locate what you want. Do we not need to go to the crypt first? Not now that your uncle has told me roughly where the vault is located, or more precisely how to locate it. He was exceedingly helpful and has given me a good idea of which documents may be of interest to us. Approaching the servants' entrance, James pulled out a large bunch of keys from his coat pocket, and after trying a few similar keys in the lock, he finally found the one to fit. The old iron key squeaked noisily as it turned in the rusty lock of the broad oak door. With a bit of encouragement from James in the form of a hefty push, the solid door finally swung back on its worn hinges to allow them access into the north wing of the great manor. I see they are obviously going for the authentic look then. One would have thought that they would have had at least oiled the hinges a bit, Chris said as the door swung open to reveal a smooth stone-paved passageway, polished smooth by the centuries of servants' feet that had hustled and bustled along it behind the scenes to ensure that the household ran like clockwork. Following the dimly lit passageway, they made their way along the servants' area until they reached the door that led into the main part of the wing itself. The first room inside the wing was the billiard room that had been lovingly restored to its former glory, complete with beautifully ornate gilded cornicing. From here they had entered another long passageway. In contrast to the billiard room, which had an oak floor, this corridor had a deep red patterned carpet and was richly decorated along one wall with huge tapestries that had been painstakingly woven. The other wall had large sash windows installed, each with its own set of full-length wooden shutters that, when drawn back, settled into alcoves around the edges of the windows, so as to appear as if they were just part of the wall itself. There were two doors leading off from the passageway, the first of which opened into what would have been known as the smoking room. The second was the entrance to the library. "I thought you said this place was deserted. It seems really clean in here for somewhere that's not used," Rachel commented, as she admired the interior of the great house. "It may not be in use, but the estate still maintains it. I think there are plans to divide it up into flats, but I'm not sure whether my uncle can bring himself to split it. So for now it's maintained and cleaned on a regular basis," James replied. Entering the library, Chris gasped in disbelief. He'd expected the library to be large, but not as vast as the sight that lay before him. So many books carefully displayed on exquisitely crafted oak cases, running around 3 of the 4 sides of the room, stretching the full height from floor to ceiling. Each side had its own sliding ladder in order to access the highest shelves. It was apparent that a great deal of trouble had been taken to restore this room. Huge amounts of money had clearly been spent to replace the books that had been lost in the last fire, many of which had been rare first editions. "Christ, there must be thousands of books here," Chris exclaimed as he tried to take in the room. "God only knows how many. I tried to count them once, but I lost my place and gave up," James interjected, smiling as he watched his friend digest this snippet of information. "Although I'm not sure they are all on display here. There is a special collections room somewhere on the 2nd floor for the rarest books, and the ones that just won't fit on the shelves." "These must be worth an absolute fortune," Chris replied at last. "Don't remind me. Sometimes it almost makes me cringe at the idea of how much was spent here. The mind really does boggle. Nevertheless, it is a fantastic collection. Speaking of which, what exactly are we looking for? I presume this is one of those cliché moments where you pull a book from a case which triggers a secret door to be revealed," James jokingly said. "Not far off. According to your uncle, we need to find 5 books on the east wall. Behind these books are located what looks like brass pins that at first glance appear to support the shelf above. In fact, these specific pins are buttons which need to be pushed in a specific order. Once that's done, I'm of the understanding that a section of the bookcase will open up. The books in the order we want are Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Iliad by Homer, The Two Gentlemen of Verona by Shakespeare, and The Golden Treasure, whatever that is, by Francis T. Palgrave. Obviously, the designer took great care in creating a locking mechanism that minimised the risk of the room being discovered by chance. These books are scattered throughout the middle section of the case on the east wall, from the very bottom right to the penultimate shelf. They're going to take some finding. There must be over 10,000 books in that section alone. Your uncle would not be any more specific than that for understandable reasons. We'd best get cracking then. At least they're not scattered through the entire collection, James said as he clapped his hands together. Rach, make yourself useful and drag that ladder over here. We're definitely going to need it at some point, Chris said, smiling at his cousin. Returning the smile with a frown at the insinuation that she wasn't useful, she obliged and dragged the ladder from its position close to the southern end of the bookcase across into the middle. It took almost 45 minutes to locate all of the pins behind the corresponding books. As the last of the pins was pushed back into the rear of the bookcase, a faint click was heard emanating from behind the case itself, and the central section retreated into the wall by an inch, to reveal the outline of the entrance to the secret vault. Chris put his hand against the outline door, expecting that it would be stiff after years of disuse. He was about to put all his weight against it. However, to his great surprise, the door had already started to fall back. It floated open, as if it was just suspended in air by some unforeseen force. Wow, this thing's as light as a feather. Such a smooth action. St. Aubin really knew his stuff, Chris stated. You mean Wren? James Piers St. Aubin only built the chapel. It was the great cathedral builder himself who was responsible for the original library, so I assume he created this marvel of engineering, James said, correcting his friend. Moving into the dark void, which had been produced by the bookcase's departure, they stepped around the edge of the case and entered the inner sanctum of the hidden vault. Rachel flicked on a flashlight so they could see what lay inside the dark sanctuary. Scanning the flashlight around the room, they discovered that the walls appeared to be lined with lead, and along them were row upon row of locked boxes, similar to the kind of a safety deposit box one would usually associate with a bank. Upon each box was a small circular brass plaque with a number engraved upon it. So many. Any ideas as to which ones we're interested in? Rachel asked as she indicated the rows of boxes along the walls. Number 27 and 58 contain the documents recommended to me by James's uncle. He believes they will be of significant interest, Chris replied. The combinations to the locks are 33, 62, 54 and 7 for number 27, and 8, 37, 64 and 17 for the other. Rach, can I borrow your iPhone? I promised that the originals would remain inside the vault, so we're going to have to take photos. After opening the boxes, Rachel handed her phone to Chris, whilst James started to pull out the contents of the two safes. After copying the reams of documents to the memory of the phone, a process that took almost an hour, the documents were returned to the safety of their boxes. Returning to the library, Chris followed the instructions he'd been given about how to reseal the vault. They waited for the door to glide back into place before heading off to the crypt. I hope you aren't creeped out by the dead. There are quite a few tombs down there, James said. Exiting the north wing, James locked the door, and they walked around the southern end of the house and continued on round to the east side where the chapel had been constructed. It was a small chapel, topped with a beautiful tall spire. The south entrance to the chapel took the form of a flight of steps leading up from the grassy bank to the chapel itself. The door leading to the crypt was built into the side of these steps. James found the key for the door on the same set he'd used to open up the main house. Due to the doorway's low height, they each had to duck down through the door as they entered. The dust lay thick on the stone steps that led down. Their footprints were left behind on the steps as they descended into the sacred house of the dead. Cobwebs hung from the walls and the ceilings of the passageway. Rachel coughed as the disturbed dust that now filled the air caught in the back of her throat as she inhaled, before brushing a stray cobweb from her eyes. The air in the crypt had taken on a musty smell. James found the light switch on the wall at the side of the passage as he entered the rectangular room. Inside, 5 large stone tombs were lined up in the middle of the room, each belonging to one or other of the earliest barons of Martinstow. Along the walls were stone plaques indicating where their spouses or children had been placed to rest, along with the more recent barons. We're looking for the tomb of the first baronet of Martinstow, St Andrew Michael Hayward. His tomb supposedly contains a few artefacts that we may need later, Chris said. Are those the ones that have been brought here from the Temple Church in London? Rachel asked. The very same, replied Chris. After wiping away the dust from the encrusted tombs, they found the one they were looking for. Beautifully carved Carran marble engraved with the coat of arms of the first baronet, and below it the family motto, Sub Pace Copia. What does that motto mean? Chris asked as he read out the inscription. Under peace plenty, I think, Rach said. Yes, very good. How do you know that? James asked. Just remember it from doing Latin at school. I'm impressed. Wouldn't have had you down as a classicist. I'm sure there are many things that would surprise you about myself. If you two have quite finished, a little help with this lid wouldn't go amiss. It hasn't been opened since the great man was laid to rest, so I suspect it's going to be quite a task to shift it, Chris said, trying to get James's attention. 3, 2, 1, heave! The lid didn't budge an inch as they strained against the hefty stone slab. Rach, give us a hand. This is proving harder to move than anticipated. Okay, ready? On the count of 1, 3, 2, 1. A grating sound could be heard as very slowly the stone top started to slide over the edges of the tomb. Little by little the lid slid across. Twice they had to stop and take a breather. As the stone slab slid enough to break the seal of the tomb, a small hiss of air was heard escaping from the tomb. Eventually they managed to slide the lid across, just enough to peer inside. The corpse of the Lord looked so peaceful, even though his dignity had just been disturbed for the first time in several centuries. His arms still lay down by his sides, his head resting on a silk pillow that remarkably had remained intact. Along with the corpse, they found 3 small bundles wrapped in linen. 2 lay down by the right-hand side of the Lord, and the other rested upon his chest. Not wanting to unwrap them just yet, Chris carefully lifted them out of the tomb and placed them into a small blue rucksack. Right, now we just need to replace this lump, Chris said, pointing at the lid. It took 10 minutes to finally shift it back into position. Before they left the crypt, Chris insisted on them saying a short prayer, as was his custom. Being a devout Roman Catholic, he felt slightly guilty at having just desecrated a tomb. He had the feeling that they needed to once again restore an element of peace to the sacred burial ground. As they finished their moment of respect, he made the sign of the cross against his chest. Making their way back up the steps, they walked out into the bright sunlight outside. I've arranged to meet Jack and Michael here, so we're going to have to wait until they arrive. Hopefully we'll not have to wait for too long, he said to the others. You'll have to forgive Michael's demeanour. He's a bit of a mon. A mon? What the hell's that? Rachel asked, slightly baffled by the slight random terminology. Oh, that's how I would describe it. How would I describe it? It's a Shropshire thing. Sort of means he's a bit of a lad. You know, sometimes comes across as being a bit overly macho. Oh, one of them. Great, Rachel said, trying not to roll her eyes too much as she replied. I presume that's where he's from, is it? Yeah, somewhere around that area. Don't think I've ever asked him exactly where. They're a bit of a rare lot down there, from my experience. They found a few benches in the gardens and relaxed in the sun, waiting for Chris's friends to arrive.